Now, if you're interested in my take on what the differences are between the 1300 GS and the 1290 Super Adventure series that I had 4 bikes of in the past few years, stay tuned, this is the video for you. What's up, my biker friend? Welcome back to another video. If you follow the channel for quite some time, you know I had 4 KTM 1290 Super Adventure models before I switched brands this year to BMW, and I own a R1300 GS now. I put the first 3,000 kilometers on it, and in this video I'm going to talk about the differences between my earlier 1290 models to the 1300 GS. Now, maybe to get one thing out of the way, it is really hard to talk about which bike is better than the other. I think it comes down to what your preferences are and what you're looking for in a motorcycle, because obviously the KTM and the BMW are quite different. There's a few things that are, crossovers. There are similar, they're both adventure bikes, big bore adventure bikes, but obviously there's a distinct sort of focus that these bikes each have. If you look at the overall motorcycle, I think if you ask someone what the difference is between the KTM and the BMW, you'd say, well, the KTM is more off-road oriented, even more so on the R model, and the BMW is probably the more comfortable bike that is more for touring, but it can ride off-road as well. But the difference is sporty off-road focus versus comfort on the road. Now, in a nutshell, that's probably right. But if you look at break it down to the separate parts of looking at the engine, looking at how the suspension works, the engine characteristic, of course, the electronic assistance that go in it, the wheel sizes that are optional on a bike, you can break it down to the various sections. Now, let's start with the most important thing. This is a motorcycle, so let's talk about the engine and the engine characteristics. The 1290 Super Adventure series with the V engine, a very powerful V engine, is something that drew me to that type of bike early on. I had a 1200 GS, the water-cooled one, the first water-cooled one that came out, the triple back version of it. And the thing that really got me to KTM was the engine characteristic of the bike. So the V engine is a bit rougher, in the throttle response is a bit snappier and rougher. It produces more top-end horsepower. It has a little less torque than the BMW 1300 GS down under, but basically it's very torquey and very powerful. And that aggressive grunt, that feeling of that engine, that is something that drew me to the KTM. It has a bit more character, let's put it this way. The BMW, in comparison, is very, very smooth. It's well behaved, very smooth. It's not as aggressive. It's almost so perfect that it's borderline boring, you could say, but it has its features when it comes to smoothness. So if you're riding, if you're touring, and you just want to glide down the road, that smoothness and that low end response, low RPM response when you have a high gear and you come around the corner and you roll on the throttle, this is what the BMW is. Very, very smooth. And it's something that I've really started to appreciate, especially here in Sardinia, where my KTM with the chain drive and the issues of having it too low RPMs. I know KTM has done quite a bit better in the later models compared to the 1190s and stuff like that. But it's still, if it's too low, the RPMs are too low, it starts jerking on the chain, and it's a pretty jerky experience. If you go around hairpin corners in second gear, I would have to feather the clutch in order to make it a smooth cornering experience. That's something that I don't have on the 1300 GS, and it takes a little while, of course, for me to get used to it because I've had these 4 KTMs, but it's something that I've really appreciated now on the engine characteristic. It's how smooth it is. I put it in second gear, sometimes even in third gear, that I can come around corners, something I couldn't do in the KTM, and it makes it for a very, very smooth ride. You don't have to feather the clutch in. It's easy. It's very, very powerful roll on off the throttle. There's a lot of torque and a lot of power coming out. Something I really appreciate. If you want to be a bit more sportive and go a bit faster, I would say probably KTM had a bit more character, and that's when you need that character, and it's a bit more fun, and the engine makes, so it sounds better too. The V2 engine has a much better sound than the Boxer engine, in my opinion. So with that combined, if you're a bit more aggressive, a bit faster on the road, that's kind of where it makes, it's fun to ride on the road with the KTM and go a bit faster. But it doesn't mean that the 1300 isn't fast at all. It's quite the opposite. In the rough ranges that most people ride their bikes, it produces quite a bit of power, quite a bit of forward momentum, despite the sort of on paper difference in top end horsepower. So when it comes to that, if you're trying to chase up a GS, a mountain on the 1290, the 1290 is not going to be a whole lot faster, if at all. Now let's talk about suspension, because that is quite a different beast on both of these bikes. They're very, very different when it comes to suspension setup. Now I have to be fair, I have to compare it to the S model, to the 1300 GS, even though I had the R model, and the comparison between the R model and this particular bike is quite a bit different, because the R model has conventional suspension, it had a bit more suspension travel, it behaved quite differently. But the S model also has a semi-active suspension system like this GS here. And the way they differ is just from the basic setup, is that the KTM in the semi-active suspension, at least for me, has a bit of a wider range, going from sort of the most comfortable, softest setting to the more sportier setting, which is more a firm setting. They have basically three increments, right? You have the sort of the street setting that's in the middle on the KTM, that's the middle setting, which would be the road setting on the 1300 GS. And then you have a comfortable setting on the KTM, which softens the suspension a little more, which here would be, I don't know what the setting is actually on the GS, if it even has that. And then there is a dynamic setting on the GS, which would be the sport setting on the KTM, where the suspension is a bit stiffer. So the range on the KTM is definitely bigger. You can feel it too, like you go over bumpy roads and you set it to comfortable setting on the KTM. It's definitely very plush setting. Here on the GS, I'm kind of missing that range, even between the road and the dynamic setting or dynamic pro setting, where in the pro settings you can have additional sort of menu settings where you can make that suspension even firmer. It's not a huge difference. I can't tell a huge difference. It's there, but it's not very big. And that would probably be, on that end, one of my biggest gripes why they don't do that. The benefit would be there to sort of give you a wider range of how the suspension system sort of copes with bad roads if you want a sort of a softer setting. But for me especially, I would like to see a sportier setting that's a bit firmer. The bike is certainly capable of being ridden pretty fast, and the suspension system, the way I have it set up now with Dynamic Pro and everything dialed into very firm, works. It would be great to have a tad more of that sportiness. Now on that end, I definitely think the way the setting works on the KTM is better, because you have more range. It just takes advantage of the semi-active suspension technology better than I think BMW does. One of the most characteristic things of a BMW is the telelever suspension designs, the front fork. It's the only manufacturer, as far as I know, that uses the telelever design. Now, even if it didn't have semi-active suspension, just the way it's set up, it prevents that typical dive that you get with conventional suspension on motorcycles. Now with semi-active suspensions that most large adventure bikes have now, you do it electronically, right? You prevent that dive when you sort of come into a corner, you brake hard. The idea is that it doesn't dive too much forward. Now with this 1300 GS, the combination of telelever and semi-active suspension, there's literally no dive when you go into a corner. Now, in most cases, that's what you want. You want a stable chassis as you go around the corner, but you lose a little bit the feel for what the sort of front part of the suspension does. With the conventional suspension, that kind of dive tells you a little bit how hard you brake into the corner. That movement gives you a bit more feedback, and I think that's when people talk about the lack of feedback on a BMW. This is what they refer to, I think. You can get certainly used to it, but it feels a bit more disconnected, I would say. Now, is one better than the other? I can say it's different. This bike rides really well on the road, so does the KTM. It's just a different feel. I can't really say what's better than the other, with the only exception is that the sort of adjustment range of the semi-active suspension is probably wider on the KTM, and I would like to see that on the BMW. Now the next thing is the handling of the bike when it comes to sort of the weight setup. And one of the things that the GS is known for is the low center of gravity, something that's definitely a big advantage when you ride off-road, but even on-road, just balancing the bike at very low speed because of the inline boxer engine. The weight of the GS is so low in the frame, the lowest of any other large adventure bike, is that it balances really, really well at low speeds. And for most riders, riding it in low speed when the bike is unstable, that really helps to give you control over the bike, and it makes it so much easier to be ridden. Especially if you don't ride a lot, or if you're not that sure about how you ride in slow speeds, the BMW really makes it easy to keep that balance. And that's something that none of the other bikes can achieve. KTM tried with the split tank design to do something similar. So this split tank design that KTM had in the latest iteration, and the current version, of course, is that the tanks were split and that the fuel would sit a bit lower in the frame. And it was noticeably better on sort of the outgoing 1290 model. Now the 1300 is available. It was one of the reasons why I went for that model, is the split tank design, because the better balance really made a difference, especially riding off-road. But when it comes to the comparison, the BMW hands down is the best bike when it comes to that. Now, handling and ergonomics between the two bikes, also quite different depending on how you set up your bike. Now, conventionally, the R model and the S model with the higher seat option, you feel like you're sitting on top of the bike, and with the GS, especially with the 1250 GS, actually with the 1300 it changed a little bit, but in the GS you feel you sit inside the bike more than sitting on top of the bike. So the way the ergonomics work, the handling works, is a little different. Now, I've changed a few settings on my bike. I have the higher suspension and I have a taller seat on it, so it is similar to the feeling that I had with my 1290 Super Adventure R, sitting on top of the bike, and also the way the bike handles now, being a bit higher up, being able to lean the bike and turn the bike, feels a bit more dynamic and snappier, if that's the right word. So it gets pretty close to, if you like KTMs and riding KTMs, it got me pretty close to what I liked about the KTM if I configure the bike this way. So I really like it. After 3,000 kilometers, the sport suspension with the higher suspension and the taller seat is definitely something I really appreciate. They still handle differently, obviously, because the KTM is top heavy and the GS has a lower center of gravity, but still you can make a few changes to the bikes to sort of dial in what you prefer. So it's hard to say what's better, KTM or BMW. They're both great. It's just something what your preference is, really. Brakes is definitely something that I would say the GS, the BMW models have the better brakes over the KTMs. I've noticed that when I started riding even the 1250 models and some of the 1300 models, that the brakes would just be better definitely for road riding. They have a little bit more bite. They're definitely very controllable. They're both Brembo brakes, and I think now they used to be Brembo brakes, at least for a time. Also on the BMWs, but the BMW brakes, I like them better, especially for faster road riding. If you need that extra bite, you need just that much less sort of power, and using two fingers and getting the bike to stop. And the KTM didn't have that. Not sure why that is. My thinking is because it has that off-road orientation, at least especially for the R model, is you don't want too much of a bite on the front brake. If you ride a bike off-road, having too much is actually not a good thing. So when I compare it, let's say, to the Desert X, which I was riding last year for a little bit, it has brakes that are better for the road than they are for off-road riding. So they're super aggressive. A little bit of a lever movement, almost locks up the brakes in the front. And so you have to be very careful, just with one finger on the brakes, trying to sort of maneuver the bike. I'm sure it's something you need to get used to. I was riding the bike just for a short period of time, but having two aggressive brakes on the front for off-road riding is probably not a good thing. Maybe that's how KTM balanced their brakes. It's not a huge difference, but it's certainly there. It's noticeable, and I would have to definitely give it to BMW, because even if you ride it slow in off-road conditions, the brakes are still good with that. So I think that just entire settings, how they dialed in between road use and off-road use, the BMW is definitely slightly better than the KTM. I'm not going to talk much about electronic assistance, because they are kind of the same in both bikes. I think they're both made by Bosch in this case. So when it comes to ABS, cornering ABS, traction control, all things that you can set on the bike. The one thing I would say to that is the assistance is you can buy additional packages. I got the Rally Pack on my KTM, where traction control is something you can dial in on the fly. So on the left hand side you had buttons to dial in the amount of traction control as you were going, so you could dial it up or down. It's something that you can't do on the BMW, and that's kind of where you see the more off-road oriented sort of trim on the KTMs, because that is something you use for off-road riding, right? And it's something I really appreciated, something you can't do. You can dial in the traction control in the sub menu, but you have to dial it in once, and you can't do it on the fly. The other important assistant that I want to talk about is the quick shifter. Now, if you would have asked me just about a year ago, when I was riding, or just before I actually took over this 1300 model, this is a 2026 model, and I was riding 9,000 kilometers on 1300 GS since last October. So this isn't really my first ride on the GS. Last year I was in Sardinia in Portugal to scout both tours. This year I did the tours. I actually had 2 Andalusia tours and 1 Portugal tour. So I put about 9,000 kilometers on a 1300 GS from 2025 triple black model from Stefan's rental fleet. Now, I've been riding that bike for quite some time, and what I didn't like is the quick shifter. Now, I had a 1200 GS, a triple black from 2016, and people have been telling me the quick shifters got better with every iteration, with the 1250, with the 1300. Every time I would get on a GS, large GS bike, the quick shifter was one of the worst parts of the GS riding experience. They're horrible the way they work, especially compared to Ducati or KTM that have dialed in the quick shifters in any ref range, up or down. The shift is smooth, and that's not an experience that I've had with the GS. Now, having said that, with the 2026 model, at least now for the first 3,000 kilometers, something has changed on the BMW. Maybe I've gotten used to it myself and I'm just shifting it in the right way, I don't know. But I think they've made improvements. Not sure why that is. Maybe it has something to do with the automatic transmissions that they've been sort of pushing, because they use that same technology, right, to shift up and down the gears. But it's smoother, especially when it comes to shifting between the second and the third gear. It's quite clunky, especially if you didn't give it full throttle. Full throttle was always fine on the GS as well. But if you had sort of mid-range, it would be quite jerky on the GS, on the 2025 models and before. Go from second to third gear, be like clunk clunk. It sounds like a Harley transmission. It was horrible. Didn't really fit the rest of the bike, which is set up perfectly. But that quick shifter experience kind of was one of the big downers. That's much better on this bike. I'm only 3,000 kilometers in it, but I think they've made an improvement. It's not as good as on the Multistrada and KTM, but it's certainly better compared to all the predecessors that were there before. So that's a good thing, because this is one of the 2 things that kind of spoiled the experience, and the quick shifter was the biggest one. The second one was actually being able to set the suspension a bit sportier, but you know, that's a small reason. Now, just with the KTM, where you have, you know, the S and the R model, you can pick different trims for the 1300 GS and kind of make it yours, right? If you're more on the comfortable traveling side, there's plenty of accessories and additional packages you can get with the GS. And in this case, I got the sort of more off-road oriented version. I've got the enduro package. I've got the sort of sport suspension in there. I don't have the adaptive ride height because I don't need it. So you can sort of specify the bike kind of to fit what you want, which is great. And you can do it again with both bikes. If off-road riding is your thing, nothing beats the KTM still to this day. The suspension is hands down the best thing on the R model. that is out on the market for off-road oriented big adventure bikes. And even though the suspension is great on the GS, none of the other bikes can compete with that. But if that's not what you want, and that's not what you were looking for, if road riding is the primary thing that you do, the GS is great. The smaller wheels, as opposed to the R model, which has the 21-inch front wheel, the smaller, the 19-inch and 17-inch wheels are better suited to cover both on-road and off-road, and especially now riding in Sardinia with smaller wheels now for me for the first time. You get a lot more grip because the tires are a bit wider. There's a lot more rubber touching the pavement. So if you lean the bike, there's always grip there. And it gives you a lot more, sort of a better feel when you corner. So that's great. So that just leaves the question open, who should get one over the other? That's a tough one because I get the questions all the time. And the thing is, I think the best way to find out is actually test ride them. You have to, and not just for a minute around the block of a dealership, but take one of these bikes out for at least a day. Ideally in conditions that you are going to ride it in. So if road riding is your thing, ride it on the road. If you want to take it on the gravel roads, put a gravel section in it and see how these two bikes sort of work for you. I think that's the best way to find out, because I don't think there's a general recommendation when it comes to a bike that does everything really well. And there's a reason why the GS has been the best seller for decades now, because it does everything really well. For the rental bikes, when we go on guided tours, or for the guys that do self-guided tours, the GS is usually the best recommendation for that, because either you have one of these and then you feel right at home, or you don't have one of these and you come from a different bike. It doesn't take a lot of time to get used to this bike. This bike makes riding really, really easy. It has always been its strong suit. It was something that convinced me to get a BMW when I came from my Harleys and I was looking for an adventure bike. And I was riding the Multistrada at the time, and I was riding the BMW. The BMW just felt better. I just felt right at home with the bike, and now having ridden this, it's kind of the same thing. It's really easy to do all these things, and appreciate the additional comfort, the smoothness of the engine, and with the trim I've picked now, it's now become my bike, so I definitely like riding it. And it's nice to have a change of pace. I will still like KTMs. I still like my 1290, and maybe one of these days I'll be riding on an orange bike again. But for the time being, happy to ride this one, and maybe that little comparison, maybe coming from a KTM rider's view, helps you in your decision making. But I think the best thing you can do is just go out there and test ride them for yourself. If you got questions, comments, your own experiences, put them in the comments section. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, ride safe, stay awesome.